But that's not the perception we get. So we get one side of this thing that the media wants, make this thing really look bad. Let's get out of here. This is not accomplishing anything. And that's not accurate. But whether you look at Nightline or CBS or Newsweek or the New York Times, or whether you look at U.S. News and World Report or NPR or PBS or anything else, you get a steady diet of, well, this is not going well. And that's the public perception that's formed. And as a matter of fact, I was talking to one of the soldiers that was going back to his second trip into Iraq. And he's going back, and he's an officer. He's over a unit. And as he gets back, there are embedded reporters with these units. That's the way that they've decided that they can keep the reporters safe. This is to embed them with the unit and let them go out. And so when he got back, he said that these reporters came to him and said, "Sir," he said, "please don't let us get killed." And the reporter saying this is officer, and he looks at him and said, "What do you mean let you get killed?" He said, we're asking you, please don't let us get killed. And he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well," he said, "we're with CNN, we're embedded with your unit, and we'll be going out with you, and you need to know right up front that CNN has told us that we are not allowed to give any positive stories on anything that happens. We've got to somehow find ways to make this look bad, and we know that could really bother you guys, and we know that you guys could turn your backs on us and walk off in a heartbeat, and we would be dead." He said, but please don't let us get killed. He said, "You need to understand this is not what we want to do. This is what we're being told that we need to do." And so I get reports like that back, which we certainly don't get on the news. But if you watch the news, yeah, it's a steady diet of negative reports. And that builds a public perception. Now, what's significant about public perception? Well, psychologists have documented that public perception is very, very important, and that it has a whole lot of impact on how other people think. And there's a great classic example of where psychologists did a test that dealt with public perception. And they brought people in, and they brought them and set them down and said, "Now we're going to show you 3 lines, and we want you to choose which line is the longest, line A, B, or C." And it was real obvious, real easy to tell. It's like, one line might be 3 inches long, and one line might be 6 inches long, but one line's like 2 feet long. So it's real easy to tell which is the longest line. It was not a trick question. And they brought them in and said, "Now we're going to show you 3 lines. Is A, B, or C the longest?" And they show you another group, and is A, B, C are the longest. And another group, and is it A, B, or C? So they show them these lines in groups of 3, and each time they ask you, raise your hand on the line that's the longest. Well, what they did was they broke the groups down, broke all the folks down into groups of 10. They put them in groups of 10 and said, "Now when we show you these groups of 3 lines, we want you to raise your hand on which line is the longest." And again, it was real easy to tell which is the longest line of the 3. It was not a trick question. But what they did was 9 out of the 10 people in the group were plants. And 9 out of the 10 people had been told that when we show you the second longest line, we want you to raise your hand there as if it is the longest line. We want to see what that one person is going to do when faced with the pressure of 9 other people who clearly are saying something wrong. That one person, it's obvious which line is longest, but everybody else in the room is going to be saying that a different line is longest. And so we're going to put 9 of you in there as plants with one person who doesn't know what's going on, and we're going to see what they do when they get to the longest line. Will they say that indeed the longest line is the longest line, or will they change it to vote with the rest of you? And so in doing this, with 9 out of the 10 being plants, what they found at the end of this test was that 75% of the people were willing to change their vote and say, no, the second longest line is actually the longest. I want to be with everybody else. I don't want to look different from everybody else. I'm going to vote the way everybody else is voting. And so that was the power of public perception. If you perceive that everybody else is saying this, everybody else is doing this, everyone else's voice is saying this, well, I don't want to be strange out there and say, well, it's really not happening that way. There's another. No, I'm going to go with everybody else, even though I know that's not what I really believe. And so that is the power of public perception, and that's where the media does become significant, because it does create perceptions. It does not necessarily report truth. It does not necessarily report falsehood. It just reports things that create perceptions. And as with anyone else, when you give reports, you're going to give reports in a way that favor what you prefer. If I write a newsletter, I'm going to fill that newsletter with things that I think are cool. Now, somebody else may not think those things are very nice, but that's what I think is cool, so that's what I'm putting in the newsletter. Well, it's the same with editors. It's the same with reporters. It's the same with owners of news stations and other entities. They're going to report what their viewpoint is, and that's what we're going to get. So, having said that, I point that out to say that in the war on terror that's been going now for a number of years, so much of what happens here in America literally has been shaped by public perception created by images that we see from the media, and quite often we do not get to hear the other side of the story. And by the way, that verse, Proverbs 18:17, is one of the very reasons that in the Bill of Rights we have the provisions and the due process clauses that allow an accused person to confront their accuser. Because if the accuser is the only one that gets to speak, man, they can make a really strong case against the indicted person. But when you get the other side of the story, you say, now wait a minute, we didn't hear that part. And that's why in law, in the Bill of Rights, we incorporate Proverbs 18:17 to make sure that we get both sides of the story before we make a decision. And before a jury gets to go out and make the decision, they've got to hear both sides of the story. But we often don't do that with the media. So that's public perception. Now, let me take you back into the war on terror and look at it from a historical and a spiritual historical perspective. There's a great quote given by President Woodrow Wilson. He says, "A nation which does not remember what it was yesterday does not know what it is today, nor what it's trying to do." He said, we're trying to do a futile thing if we don't know where we've come from or what we've been about. Now, that's true. And when you look at the war on terror and where we are right now, in the very region of the country or of the world where that war is being fought, that's not the first time we've been there. Americans have had troops on the ground over there even 200 years ago. Now, again, if I can return to our common public perception right now of that region of the world, what we often get on the news media is all the protests that happen over in the Muslim area of the world, over around the Mediterranean Sea, the eastern shore and the southern shore and the northern shore. We see all these protests that are happening, and even far east of that, as you get into Pakistan and other countries as well, you see all these massive protests against Americans. You know, really interesting thing, and people don't often ask this question when they see it, but you see these protests on TV with all these Muslims marching and carrying signs, and signs like America's the killer of innocent Muslims, and George Bush is the world's biggest terrorist, and etc. And people don't realize, but those signs are in English. Now think about it for a minute. The region of the country where those protests are going, and sometimes we see protests from across the world. We see them across the islands in Indonesia and Micro-Indonesia, and we see them in different parts of Africa. And interesting thing is they don't speak English as their primary language in those nations. And a lot of them don't even speak English as a second language. And yet the signs we see on TV are all in English. Now, why would that be? Why would we be seeing signs in English? Well, again, those other nations, Muslims, know the power of media, and they know the power of the American media, and they're happy to feed stuff into the American media to get the American media to carry it home, and it's their propaganda. And it's interesting that a lot of times you can actually go on the web, and when there's a picture in the newspaper, if you go on the web, you can find that picture, and a lot of times it's a lot larger than what you see on the newspaper. The newspaper will show the signs, how they're really angry at America, and if you back out on the newsprint, you'll actually see that most of the signs are printed in Arabic, which is the common language for so many of these folks protesting. But what we see in America is the American signs, as though that was what the whole protest was about, and it's just not that.